Chapter 71. As the days go by, your little party of two continue to encounter disruption after disruption, as the low-lives of the region were apparently unable to understand that attacking the 3-meter-tall knight clad in blackened armor was a terrible idea. But you understood that none of those bandits could genuinely be called sane as they continued to rob the good people of the Seven Kingdoms while the armies of the king and the great houses who have finally managed to deal with the Ironborn uprising have yet to be disbanded. It genuinely felt like these men have gone insane, as only someone truly mad would risk sticking out while the crown and the great houses have been thoroughly drained of all their patience and self-restraint by the war. You don't even want to think about what the king's troops are said to have done to the thousands of Ironborn that failed to flee the mainland in time. A simple death through the sword really isn't the worst fate one can expect for messing with the crown these days, and yet these absolute morons keep on springing up in the dozens. You would guess that their stupidity was the main reason for why you cared less and less about what happened to them as your journey continued, and these troublemakers just kept on coming. There were some people in the world that were apparently just beyond saving, and you most certainly won't risk your life by stepping between the monster and its prey, as you already knew what he could do. And you could imagine what would happen to you if you tried, seeing as even the normal knights that were actually still willing to talk with you weren't all that fond of the beautiful assassin that tried to take their lord hostage. But all jokes aside, you could very much so do without adding a personal guardian of the Lannisters to your list of enemies as you watch him stomp a grown man to death as if it was nothing. Yeah, stepping on his toes doesn't really strike you as that great of an idea if it means that he would be stepping on you in the near future as well, especially seeing as you were quite happy about the intact state of both your ribcage and head. And that conviction to not do anything about what you were seeing further deepened as the normally passive night seems to become even darker and a lot more brutal as the days continue to go by. You were witnessing a spiral of violence that was getting more and more disturbing with each new ambush, till the second half of your journey was finally coming to an end as you and your companion reached the outer mountains of the Vale. Though, the display of strength left you wondering why the both of you were sent to the other side of the continent together if the knight was clearly uninterested in stealth. You had an idea of what you were here to do, but you couldn't say the same about the gory knight behind you. It seems like a massive waste to deploy him here if the Lannisters weren't trying to start a war with the Errands. It didn't make sense, no matter how much you thought about it. The best you could come up with is that he could help you against the mountain clans that once dwelt in the region. Though as far as you knew that also wouldn't make much sense as the Errands didn't march their armies against the Ironborn, meaning they're all still guarding the Vale, and no amount of tribes can win against the heavy knights of House Arryn. Your companion remained quiet about the whole matter as you asked him, only pointing upwards to a small destroyed path on the nearest mountain, presumably once created to take the Vale when the Ironborn still had their own massive realm on the continent. This was more than you usually got from your nameless companion, so you swiftly began to follow after him as he began to walk towards the mountain he had just pointed at. You were surprised that most of the path wasn't nearly as old as it looked from the road below, but you both still had to stop your ascent when darkness claimed the Vale after a few exhausting hours. It surprisingly didn't seem to bother him all that much despite the speed he had set for the both of you, but you supposed that following a safe path that provides a great view of the Vale would calm everyone after the madness of the Reach and the Riverlands. Mayhaps he does have some kind of limits after all, or perhaps he's just letting you rest. You would be happy with both propositions as this really wasn't what you had originally expected when the letter sent you off to infiltrate the Vale with your companion. But that being said, you still very much so enjoyed the silence and safety as your dark companion was standing silently behind you like usual. It shows that there is a positive side to everyone and everything, even someone like him. And at least you finally understood why the knight was here now as you quietly observe the flames and what remains of the Vale in the distance. Yes, perhaps having a 3-meter-tall knight with you isn't such a bad idea, even if he won't be of much use when it comes to the infiltration mission itself. You certainly had no intention of finding out if those countless burning villages would be held by the knights of the Errands or the tribes of the Vale in the morning, nor did you wish to find out how they will feel about you. So you could see that the suddenly very nice-looking knight now standing to your right was always required for your survival. As an assassin or proactive agent as they called it can't really travel on the roads from village to village while a war like this is going on. The only way for you to get into Arryn-controlled territory without raising some kind of suspicion will require you to travel through the woods, as messages would fly way too fast if something happened. And seeing as you're thinking about traveling through the woods filled to the brim with bandits and the currently raiding mountain tribes that do who knows what to their prisoners, you have to admit again that the monster in gory armor to your right looks really quite nice right about now. Though what worried you even more than the tribes now that you think about it was that the Lannisters had an awfully large amount of knowledge about what you would need to fulfill their mission in this not very natural feeling madness. It seems like your new lords like to gamble. Chapter 72. Your journey through the great woods of the Vale was going a lot smoother than you had dared to hope, but that swift and quiet progress ended just a few short days later. The scouting parties from at least 5 different tribes that decided to ambush you and your companion on the very same day should have been a pretty clear sign that you weren't using what you would call the best route for the job. But your companion remained unbothered by the fact that you were trespassing on land currently claimed by at least 5 different mountain clans, much to your annoyance. You were aware of the fact that he wasn't actually trying to provoke those countless clans and tribes you encountered on purpose, as their deaths were far less brutal than those of the bandits you two had encountered in the former lands of the Reach and the Riverlands. But you could make the guess from the very first encounters you had with the scouts that they wouldn't care about how soft he was being to them while he was continuing to butcher their friends and loved ones. It was a situation that you knew would only mean more and more trouble as they tried to find out who was actually killing their scouts before they finally turned on one another in the confusion. You could once more guess that some of the more ambitious clans were filling the woods with carnage, as the stronger tribes were far too spread out and vulnerable as they focused on their search. Though that being said, this lunacy actually felt unnaturally contained, as none of the surrounding clans took advantage of either side in all this madness. And with their disinterest, only the corridor your companion had chosen to travel through was falling apart, which simply doesn't make sense to you as forests don't really have those kinds of borders. So you genuinely didn't get what was going on as you and the gore-covered monster you now called companion were walking in and out of territories that should have been impossible to cross with the sheer number of madmen filling the surrounding woods. But as you continued to think about it, you supposed that you've got some decent ideas for why nothing seems to really add up. And the one that sounded the most sane to you was that this whole madness must have been set up. Whoever was in command of all those tribes was willing to let you two squeeze through, but wasn't willing to let anyone know about the fact. It would make a decent amount of sense if House Lannister was truly backing all of this, as you couldn't really believe that simple clansmen could do this much damage to the Vale on their own. And it would make sense that some king or high chieftain couldn't afford to be seen receiving bribes in exchange for favors such as this. Yes, it all made sense. Though the knight remained annoyingly silent on the matter, not that you genuinely believed that he would actually bother to give you a proper response. Some people just enjoy some good silence, you supposed. Or perhaps the Lannisters had some kind of punishment that involved cutting out the tongues of their guards, seeing as none of the other knights in blackened armor ever spoke so much as a single word. Just thinking about it made you shiver in disgust at how fucked up that kind of punishment would be, but it's the kind of fucked up that perfectly fit the dark humor of the Lannisters' current lord, if what you heard of him was indeed accurate. Something along the lines of, if one of you speaks so much as a word of what you've seen today, then none of you will get the chance to do so again. Yeah, it would really be the kind of fucked up and brilliant punishment low-born people like you naturally expected and feared to receive from the great houses one day. You were relieved that you could finally make some sense from all this insanity, but you swiftly refocused your mind on dealing with the man lurking behind a bush in front of you as your companion cleaned up the clansmen that tried their luck with him. Stupidity can't be cured, it seems. The ranger in front of you naturally remained still and quiet as you both silently listened to how your companion happily continues to make your mission even more difficult. Scaring the first person you came across since you entered the Vale that would be of actual use to the mission really wasn't optimal, but you also knew your companion good enough that you could guess just how much complaining about his way of doing things would help you now that things had already deteriorated. Hence, you simply decide to wait for him to finish up as you thought about how you could approach the boy without adding further issues into the already annoying situation. And after you thought about it a few seconds longer, your mind came up with a small but decent idea for how you could get the boy to reveal himself while also improving upon his mental state, as sending the giant gore-covered knight to get him didn't really promise to do much good when it came to calming the boy down. The best idea you could come up with on the spot was entirely focused on giving him the chance to take the initiative to make sure that he would remain open to your words and suggestions. Thus, you sweetly asked the absolutely terrifying knight if he could be so good and conceal the bodies with the help of some bushes near one of the trees before you. trees that the little ranger should be able to see directly in front of him in the hope that it would force him to get out of the way or be spotted, without actually pressuring him. Instinct, that's all it comes down to, and the instinct of a ranger is not to be spotted no matter what. So you're sure that his mind will adapt to the situation and refocus on pushing away the almost supernatural fear your silent companion tends to inspire when he finally starts moving from his position, with the hope that curiosity will get the better of him, and well, hope is cheap enough for you to expend it. Chapter 73. Things were working out for once, and it was actually quite shocking as life seems to take great pleasure from thoroughly trashing your plans while it does nothing about the problems you are usually facing. The saying that life fucks everyone equally never really rang true with you, but seeing that boy swiftly recompose himself before he silently approaches the two of you from the left made you wonder just how life decides who it will support. Combined with the fact that you were now serving a great house for more gold than most minor nobles will ever see, and you're surprisingly filled with hope that you might actually be experiencing a genuine stroke of good luck for once. But equally surprising was the fact that the two of you were still a decent stretch, as in several days, away from actually reaching the hosts of the Vale as they were shockingly forced to retreat by the countless new tactics of the clans. Though, as the boy continues to explain why things were more dire than they seemed, you really had to wonder what the Errands were thinking when they decided to spare themselves the effort of clearing the mountains just once. The little ranger of course knew none of these thoughts about his lords, and thus simply continues to lead both you and your companion back to his superiors in Darwin Castle while he continues to distract himself from your gory companion with the explanation. You couldn't help but be both sickened and impressed with what you heard about their new strategies, though one quite daunting tactic in particular made you wonder why the clans hadn't used it before, if they really didn't care about how they were fighting their wars anymore. The tactic of going after the enemy's supply of drinking water wasn't really all that new, but throwing already decomposing corpses down every well they could reach proved far more effective than it should have reasonably been. The Knights of the Vale should have been more than able to use their mobility to secure and protect the transportation of enough water and supplies from somewhere else in the Vale, but the clans were apparently set on abusing that mindset to its fullest. For the war was started on the mountain clans' terms, which meant that the Knights of the Vale soon found out that they had to send out thousands upon thousands of their number to retake smaller castles and hold that were swiftly overrun and fortified in the first nights of the conflict's bloody beginning. The little grey ranger informed you after a bit more probing that everything was perfectly set up and that the knights with their pride not just rode but charged right into one hell of a trap. For while the hosts of the Vale were still able to move and fight back as they proved by striking down each and every clan that dared to raid in their proximity for weeks on end, that didn't mean that the clans themselves had any interest in fighting said hosts in such engagements. The trap only became apparent for what it was after the knights could no longer push forward as they were stopped by 3 to 6 meter deep gorges and barricades braced by the ancient trees of the Vale's thick forests, and by then it was sadly already far too late for anything to be done. It doesn't take a genius to realize what he meant, though you still needed that last part to fully understand why there was still this much chaos after the hosts of the Vale had pushed the tribes and clans out of most of their castles. The clans were here to stay and not just to raid, and that's not something anyone would have expected, seeing as even those simultaneous attacks on the holds of the Vale simply weren't on the level of manpower one would expect of a full-scale migration. And you guessed that the answer to where that missing manpower was hiding became rather obvious as more and more hosts encountered similarly fortified gorges as they advanced throughout the woods. For the clans hadn't actually raided to gain wealth and prestige as usual, but instead to make sure that every knight was committed and accounted for as they quietly built their positions. And through the destruction of the wells the vital supply of drinking water was so endangered that the clans could make sure that all these countless nights would be occupied and once more accounted for by deploying only a few thousand expendable warriors to threaten these absolutely vital lines of supply. The scheme didn't have the goal of wiping out the armies of House Arryn in one go, nor did the clans genuinely care about the castles and holds they took. No, the goal of their trap was to stretch the lines of the knights throughout passable and unpassable terrain alike. They never planned to fight the hosts of the Errands for so much as a second, and thus created a tactic that would ensure that the defenses of their enemies would become absolutely porous and disorganized. It was a trap that if executed correctly would force the great armies of House Arryn to retreat and reorganize their hosts from scratch, something that couldn't be done fast nor on a whim. So what you saw when you first entered the Vale with your companion was one of those moments, a full-scale retreat by one of the mighty hosts of the Vale that left hundreds of square kilometers and with it dozens of towns and villages alike undefended for at least 4 nights. And going by what your guide was telling you, the situation was already pretty bad before you had even accepted your job in the Reach, but by now a little over a fourth of House Aaron's territories were under the control of the mountain clans. While said mountain clans were now able to equip themselves with the scavenged armor and weapons of the best knights the realm could field, as smaller clans continue their work on the fortifications now far less silently. Thus, new gorges connecting to the old ones were slowly springing up each day, while more and more trees were being cut down to build new barricades where they were still needed. You honestly didn't understand why neither the king nor the great houses were willing to help the Aarons out, but you also didn't think that there was a single town that had less than a dozen passionate answers to that question, so you just pushed the matter away for now. Chapter 74. Darwin Castle was just like you had imagined, more mountain than castle, as you could count a total of at least 8 gatehouses as you continued to stroll through the fairly large markets of both Eastwind and Westwind in search of something you hoped would become quite useful in the future. Though, your search was sadly cut short when you heard that most members of the local merchant guild had annoyingly already left the premise for the lands of House Lannister around 2 weeks ago. You supposed that it made sense as most merchants have very little that actually binds them to the lands they trade on beyond some contracts that could simply be terminated if they were willing to take the hit to their purse. But that you could understand their way of thinking didn't really help you with quelling your annoyance at not obtaining those dyes and the nice fabric you wanted to get for your companion. He would never be able to blend in with his massive frame, and that as if one was inclined to ignore the equally massive black armor, so you needed him to fit in if blending in just wasn't an option. And while it sounds absolutely insane that stuff like the colors one decides to wear might actually still matter to some people while the Vale was burning, the fact of the matter was that these very same people that care about such madness were the ones you were tasked to get close to for the Lannisters, and that much red simply wouldn't do. The night wasn't originally part of your plan, but you also didn't design your infiltration with the current state of the Vale in mind either, so you found yourself quite willing to add another few layers of contingencies to your plan by openly deploying your companion. Lord Darwin might have been surprisingly accommodating, but that had more to do with the fact that the knight behind you was covered in the remains of the very clansman that butchered his small folk at the time. And such a deed naturally demands a decent amount of respect from any lord that has a shred of honor, especially from the laudable and prideful lords of the Vale. But you knew that a lesser man would have certainly found more than a few issues with your companion's presence, seeing as that particular knight was clearly from House Lannister, so literally from the other side of the continent. And you're sure that most lords wouldn't be all that pleased to find some tongue-tied knight of a great house deep in the forests of their lands, where he did who knows what for who knows what reason. Though, you supposed that the 3-meter-tall knight didn't enter the service of House Lannister to do anything other than smash their enemies with his warhammer, so you understood why everything around him felt as commanding as it did. But that you could understand their standpoint for equipping him this way didn't mean that you agreed with it for so much as a second. For despite all the competence your companion had shown you throughout your little journey, it genuinely feels like they didn't think of the knight under the armor as anything more than a weapon to be used in House Lannister's name. And that was, if nothing else, a massive waste of potential in your eyes, as his prowess alone was enough to make him a perfect assassin material, with how it would allow him to take on a chamber filled with dozens of knights relatively safely as far as you've seen. You even adapted your plan for infiltrating House Aaron to include him, as no one would suspect that the most noticeable knight in the Vale and his servant girl could really be responsible for the decapitation strike through poison and brute force that you had in mind. Mayhaps you could gain some favor by bringing the matter up to your new lords once you manage to finish your mission to prove your belief that it doesn't really matter if he's actually stealthy or not, as long as there are no witnesses once the job is done. It should be pretty similar to how no one clads their archers with plate, as there's simply no point in doing so. Not everyone needs a set of imposing heavy armor to do their part. No, you would already be satisfied if his equipment would become a bit more practical in the future. You genuinely believe that the monster of a knight you call your companion wouldn't actually need to be stealthy to be an assassin if his current looks didn't so memorably scream Lannister to everyone around him, as people wouldn't need that long to connect him to the corpses afterwards. It was a bit saddening that Darwin Castle had to burn, but you were sure that you would lose your head in no time at all if the errands were to move against your new lords, because word got out about a certain giant knight clad in deep red fabric and blackened steel, which, seeing as the will to live has yet to leave you, didn't sit all that well with you. So with your mind made up, you returned to your inn and wait for night to fall over the vale once more. You had little interest in condemning the province to a bloodbath, but it's not like House Darway had the strength to hold their lands for much longer anyway, if you consider that both of House Darway's biggest towns, namely Eastwend and Westwend, were protected by simple wood walls with Darway Castle between them. And a fully garrisoned castle with 2 towns worth of guards in one spot really makes for one impressively juicy encirclement, especially with how the territories of the Darways were already filled with at least hundreds of clansmen that continued to swiftly extend their fortifications in preparation to stretch the lines again. You could admit to yourself that you were by now just trying to justify what you were planning to do, as you already knew what would happen if the cornerstone of House Darway's defense was set alight and their lord along with his household would be slain in the current situation. But when you said to yourself that it didn't matter, you weren't lying to yourself either, as the mountain clans had apparently taken far greater holds within mere hours. You honestly can't see a future in which the merchants now sitting in the lands of House Lannister would get to see any of their old patrons again, even if they fled this very moment, as they would just provoke an early attack. The whole mess continues to be absolutely disgusting, as you honestly didn't wish to worsen the lot of these people, though you could tell that the monster you call your companion remained annoyingly unbothered as usual. And you of course knew by now that this lack of interest depressingly doesn't stem from a lack of understanding. No, he just genuinely didn't give a damn about the problem of morality you were still trying to push down. Perhaps you were wrong, and he's really just a weapon. Chapter 75. In the end, you simply decide to follow the example of your companion, as your situation wasn't going to become any less of a mess just because you wasted valuable time on thinking about stuff you honestly couldn't afford to change. But be that as it may, the fact was that neither you nor your companion could be seen as agents of House Lannister no matter what. It was a bit bothersome that you didn't have a way to find the rangers of House Darway to make absolutely sure that everyone is silenced. But seeing as most of them didn't return to neither Darway Castle itself nor Eastwind or Westwind, you supposed that there was little point in going through the effort of hunting them down, as you're pretty sure that doing so would actually increase the chance that one of them would inform a neighboring house about what happened, and that absolutely wouldn't do. There's still the possibility that the boy might become a problem, but there was also a good chance that he's already lying somewhere dead in the undergrowth of one of the forests surrounding Darway Castle, so that was that. You spent a few more hours thinking about what you could do to plug the more obvious holes of your plan till your companion nudged you out of your stupor as the night had finally broken in, so you supposed that it was now or never. Darway Castle was in possession of truly formidable defenses like all true castles of the Vale, but while the home of the Darways was great in size, it was clearly one of the youngest holds that could be found in the Vale. For Darway Castle was essentially just a fortified cluster of buildings that was hiding behind a total of 8 great gatehouses spread across the mountain. It was actually why you had originally decided that burning the whole thing down was not just the flashiest, but also the easiest way to get rid of it, as you were quite sure that House Darway didn't have the spare resources to casually dig a well through their mountain, which meant that the flammable heart of Darway Castle was most likely entirely dependent on the water reserves in its cisterns if a fire broke out. Meaning that if you and your companion managed to speedily infiltrate the castle and block off or even collapse those cisterns before the knights of House Darway realize what's going on, there would be a decent chance that the fire will force them to abandon the castle, which would split their forces in two. They would of course still have the massive gatehouses, but once the clans move to surround and starve them out, those defenses won't really make a difference when their supplies and messenger birds alike have long since turned to ash. You actually liked this little plan of yours quite a bit, as it gave you another relatively safe opportunity to further increase your value to the Lannisters, but the death toll that would come with your success still bothered you. It was a bit ridiculous that you were preoccupied with this nonsense even as you and your companion were slowly climbing up the steep but unfortified northern side of the mountain. Yet you couldn't bring yourself to see the fact that you still had a working conscience as something bad, even if it keeps on distracting you to an annoying degree, as you've already seen what can happen to people that leave that part of themselves behind. When you pushed these thoughts away to focus on the rock in front of you a few minutes later, you had honestly expected that your companion would by now have a pretty difficult time as he was still clad in his armor, despite how little sense that made. You knew that some people were ridiculously stubborn and would go to any length just to prove that they could do the impossible, but actually climbing all the way up the mountain in a suit of plate armor was beyond moronic. It had made you doubt his sanity when he first started climbing, but you knew for sure that this companion of yours wasn't nearly as dense as the nonsense he was currently pulling made him seem. Who knows, perhaps he's actually the shy kind of guy. Sigh, it seems like your mind really wasn't working as it used to if the guy that can squish grown men into puddles of blood and gore by the dozens suddenly looks shy to you. Really, what a bothersome mess this was. But at least the plan was still working, as the northern side of Darwin Castle had at most half a dozen guards from the little light you could see and the spare amount of dialogue you could hear another 20 or so meters above you. Yes, this was absolutely doable. And indeed it was, for while you had to climb down a bit to stop the advance of the knight so that the guards wouldn't hear him, once you climbed back up and took care of the unlucky bunch of guards, the castle was pretty much defenseless. You knew that the best way to take care of the cistern permanently was to take care of the pillars, which was why you split up with your companion as soon as he caught up with you. As you could guess just how silent the task of blowing out the support pillars would be, and seeing as the fire would need to be laid simultaneously for maximum chaos so that you could actually flee the burning castle yourselves, there was no one better for the job than your armored companion. For you could also guess just how difficult it would be to get out of there once everyone in the castle tries to get to the water before the flames rage out of control. Yes, that really wasn't a task you were confident in surviving. Though, you supposed that you could use it to point out how good your favorite monster would do as an assassin if you got the chance to speak with your new lords once more. You continued to think about this strange companion of yours as the castle swiftly fell to absolute madness till you were finished with your part of the job and simply waited in the shadow of a small pile of crates you were happily plundering on the currently still cleared out northern wall. You didn't need to wait long for your companion to finish up, as you soon found that he stood silently by your side once more, naturally completely covered in blood as you had expected. But that being said, there was no reason for him to just stand by your side in the current situation, so you swiftly joined him to see what had caught his interest to such an extent. And what you found as you stared out over the darkened lands beyond filled you with a weird sense of nostalgia, as the veil was once more burning as it did the night you had first entered it. The madness surrounding you now both near and far filled your face with a self-deprecating smile as all thoughts about the morality of your mission left you, while you wondered why you had even bothered to worry if this state has already become the norm for the lands of House Lannister.